Now, the Portuguese are not the only people to kind of force their way into the spice trade in the Indian Ocean in the 15th and 16th century. Once other Western European states realized the profit to be made in this South African trade route, um, they very quickly get themselves involved. The Spanish are the next, or the first actually, to challenge the Portuguese in and around the 1500s. However, they approach this from a much different method than the Portuguese did. The Spanish are much better funded. They have greater access to resources thanks to their empire in the Americas. And unlike the Portuguese, they focus on full scale colonization, right? And the first territory in which they do this is the Philippine Islands. So, by colonizing the Philippines and by bringing their aggressive conversion to Christianity to the islands, this gives the Spanish a full scale base of operations in the Pacific Ocean. And it's going to become the center of their trade with Asia and specifically China. And the massive amounts of silver that the Spanish are pulling out of South America are all going to funnel through the Philippines on their way to China in order to purchase Chinese goods like silk and etc. Right. Another thing that colonizing the Philippines does is this gives Christianity another outpost in East Asia. And the Spanish, especially the Jesuit order, are highly aggressive in their missionary work, creating an almost Catholic monopoly over the Philippines. And this leaves a big cultural footprint on the Philippines even to today. Again, the Spanish install a racial and ethnic casta over the Philippines, very strict social hierarchy. The Spanish language, Spanish culture, Spanish food, Spanish religions all become a dominant part of Philippine culture that, again, is still seen in that country even now. And just like the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, this is going to set a precedent for when we reach the 19th century in terms of how to colonize and imperialize in Asia. Um, Pretty soon after the Spanish begin colonizing in the Philippines, the British and the Dutch also begin to get involved in the early 1600s. Now, one of the ways in which the British and the Dutch innovate on the Portuguese model is that rather than involve the government and the monarchy directly, the British and the Dutch involvement in the spice trade is through privately funded what's called joint stock companies. And this is a pretty important economic innovation here. And it's one that is going to become really important going forward, not only in terms of, globalized trade, but also just simply the concept of stock, which is going to lead to publicly owned companies and stock markets later on down the line. So, joint stock companies are essentially private companies that are chartered or given government permission to engage and, in most cases, monopolize a specific kind of trade. Now, what makes them unique is that they're funded through the sale of stock. So, essentially, you are buying a percentage of a trade mission. Okay. You are buying a percentage stake in a set of ships that are going to go out and try to make a profit. Now, by doing this, what happens is this allows people to more easily fund trade missions to certain parts of the world. Because again, this is not, this is not a guaranteed thing. Storms, piracy, all of these are risks that merchants are taking in traveling from Western Europe to the Indian Ocean. So by selling this as shares of stock, people are able to more easily fund because you can appeal now to smaller investors rather than only people who own their own fleets of ships. Also, you spread the risk of the voyage over a wider area. over more investors, so that if something terrible does happen, and the fleet is destroyed, no one person is financially liable for all that, and the damage to them financially is minimized. Also, one of the benefits of joint stock companies is that they're not dependent upon the royal treasury. Both the Spanish and the Portuguese governments funded the majority of the exploration and the colonization of the Indian Ocean trade. So, whenever the government fell on hard times, those trading posts and those colonies would suffer because they don't have the financial support that they need so far from home. So by privately funding these through the sale of stock, these joint stock companies were able to continue to operate even in times of political turmoil, which helps to stabilize them and make them more profitable. Now, through these government charters, for the most part, these companies are given full monopoly over trade in certain goods or with certain regions and certain ports. Not only that, but they are licensed by their government to arm ships, hire soldiers, and essentially engage in private war against any competing nation. And this is going to bring an entirely new era to the Indian Ocean trade. Um, Not that navies with armed ships are anything new in the Indian Ocean. The Ming Dynasty and its tribute fleet were the largest navy ever seen. But this idea of privately licensed war and privately licensed piracy adds a complete new level to the interactions in the Indian Ocean. So what happens is in the early 1600s, the British and the Dutch found what's known as the East India Companies. And these East India Companies become the biggest commercial enterprises in the world. And joint stock companies become the standard for transoceanic trade. Essentially, privately funded companies that are able to make war, they are able to settle and colonize, they are able to enslave and build plantations with the full backing and support of their own royal government. And because of this more efficient business model, the British and the Dutch are very quickly and easily able to undercut the Portuguese and the Spanish merchants and kind of run them out of the Indian Ocean network. Now, in terms of their focus, the British focus their attention on India, while the Dutch focus their attention on what's known as the Spice Islands in East Asia. The British, since they are unable to challenge or displace the Mughals in India, they kind of copy the Portuguese model. They establish trading posts, they negotiate and purchase exclusive trading rights in certain Indian cities, which gives their merchants a monopoly over all of the goods coming in and out of there. They also use those trading rights to tax any kind of revenue going in and out of the ports. And they also build massive shipping companies within the region so that they can transport the goods in and out of India, even if it's not to be bought and sold for their merchants. The Dutch, on the other hand, follow the Spanish more closely, and they use their resources to fully colonize a number of the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. And they very brutally and very quickly um, conquer the islands, enslave the native populations, and they establish plantation colonies pretty much everywhere that they settle. And within about 50 years or so, they become the dominant suppliers of spice to Europe. And what you're going to see over the next couple of centuries is because of their willingness to make war against economic competitors, because of their advancements in military and naval technology, both of these two countries, the British and the Dutch, as well as the French to a smaller degree, are going to gradually expand their positions in the Indian Ocean. And by the 19th century, this is going to become a full scale colonization in India and Southeast Asia.